Welcome back to another episode of Digital Voices. My name is Bo Tiffany. We talk about what's on our hearts, what's on our mind, talk about the issues of today. And one of those issues is one that's near and dear to my heart, and that centers around medical errors. I am fortunate enough to have our guest, Scott Simpson, on today to talk about medical errors and his experiences, as he's been a representative and a champion for these victims in Canada. So I want to welcome Scott on and say thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you, Bo. Thanks for having me. It's my first time being on this side of the microphone for a podcast, so it'll be a new experience for me.
Well, I'll try to be easy on you. So tell us about yourself. You're from Canada. What's your background? Where are you from exactly?
Well, I grew up on a farm about an hour and a half northwest of Toronto, so not too far removed from the big city. And then came to Toronto to go to university. Started out as a film major, but really liked psychology, so I ended up as a psych major. And then fast forwarding through my life, in 1998, I was diagnosed with HIV, which would have explained why I was so sick. So I started on meds, and that turned, not only my health around, it gave me a second chance at life. So I took a look at what was going on in the HIV AIDS world. And so that was pretty much when the AIDS pandemic was at its height. And so there's some of those experiences echo with today's pandemic, but we can circle around back to that.
Sure.
And so I took a look at the landscape, the global landscape of where was the need the greatest for HIV, and that was obviously in sub-Saharan Africa. So I joined with two men that had been with Doctors Without Borders. One of them was their international president, and they were just starting a new organization that was specifically focused on HIV/AIDS and getting meds to people. And so I joined up with them. They're called Dignitas International. And we had a project in Malawi and brought the HIV medications that keep me alive to eventually millions of people in Malawi. So that was a very meaningful experience with our healthcare system. And I like to say that it contrasts very starkly with my experiences with the healthcare system starting a few years after that.
Sure. Well, and I think you're seeing two sides of that fence, right? The frontline workers that really are in the field to help and do no harm and try to be that traditional doctor. But then you have the backside of it too, where it's the administration and the company who are looking after their stockholders and, the people of interest that, there's a fight there. And I think obviously one has more power than the other, which kind of seems to contradict itself. Is that what you would describe as your experience, or do you see that differently?
Well, in Canada, we don't have so much of a for-profit healthcare system.
Okay.
So there isn't as much, I suspect, of the corporate pressure as in the U.S., but that's not to say that there isn't corporate pressure within Canada. But I totally concur with you that there's this tension between the people who go into healthcare with their values of wanting to help people, and then they run up against a system that prioritizes profit over people. And so they've got this conflict of their values against the system's values, and that can cause a whole lot of problems just within themselves.
Sure. You raised a great point, which is a major difference between your country and mine, and that's that your healthcare is federally funded, where ours is not. How does that work in terms of quality of care, in your opinion?
It's spotty. It's great that, the most folks don't have to think about the cost of healthcare when they're in an emergency situation and needing to call an ambulance or needing to get something checked out or just anything that's going to incur cost. So not having that worry is a huge weight lifted off a person's shoulders.
Right.
But there's good and bad within the system. It's good when it's something that's typical, like a broken arm. They can easily fix that. HIV/AIDS, they've come a long way with that. So there's lots of treatment, lots of doctors, lots of support. But within the system, there's a huge, huge gap.
So how does one, let's say, we'll give you a scenario. I am John Doe, and I just went into the hospital, and a medical error caused me harm. How would the traditional, how would that normally play out for that individual in Canada?
So in Canada, we don't seem to have insurance companies for physicians. Instead, there's this other entity called the CMPA, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, and they're a bunch of lawyers. And so being lawyers, they take a very us versus them approach to medical error. So they seem to advise the hospitals and the doctors not to admit any error. So it immediately, instead of there being communication about the error and having the patient involved in a process and having the physician or the hospital involved in a process where it's basically truth and reconciliation, instead of that, it goes down the legal route where the doctors, the lawyers behind the doctors, essentially try to take a legal tactic of delaying the court case, because if the patient dies before the case comes to court, then the case is automatically dropped. Or they run up the bill of the patient because the patient is paying for their own lawyer. So you basically starve them to death. And so they drop the case that way, just adding more stress to it so that the patient drops the case. So I think the stats are that very few of the medical error cases or that are filed, complaints that are filed, very few of them go to court, and a very few of them are decided in the favor of the patient. I think it's like 1 or 2%. So for all intents and purposes, there really isn't a system that allows patients proper redress.
We have the same issue here in the United States. And unfortunately, we also have the other chapter, or that other side that you don't have, which is the companies. You know, these are corporations, and so there's a self-interest there. So there's a limiting of transparency, accountability, and there's a lot of cover-up tactics. So sounds very similar. And that obviously, creates a secondary and a third injury. Now, having us be a privatized healthcare system versus a public healthcare system, how long have you been championing for change, or how long has medical errors or medical malpractice or just that kind of niche of this, how long has there been awareness, and how long has that been a movement to try to make change in that area?
When I was working with the International Medical Humanitarian Organization, I was working in Malawi, and I was working directly with folks on the ground there. And that's when I realized, hey, that's what I really wanted to do, because up to that point, I was mostly about fundraising. Right. So when I got back to Canada, I started switching into what I call frontline work. So I retrained as a counselor and got into counseling mostly folks in the HIV/AIDS community. And in doing so, in a lot of those counseling sessions, I would frequently hear how they experienced medical errors. Some of them were just minor, some of them were near misses, some of them impacted their lives forever. So that's when I first became aware of sort of the ubiquitous of medical errors, and I colleague and I would joke that, we hear these reports of medical errors so frequently, we should just set up a website called stupidshitdoctorsayanddo.com and we'll have the patients go and tell their stories there. It'll be therapeutic, it'll be informative, and maybe it'll have some change. But, at that point, it was just sort of on my periphery. And then I got sick with another chronic illness that's on the other extreme of the healthcare system, where it's medically marginalized. Doctors aren't taught anything about it. There's no research funding. There's no treatment. Often the patients are gaslighted or given psychoactive medications for illnesses they do not have.
Can I pry just a little bit, just so we can give our listeners more of a context in terms of this field? What is it that they're not giving enough emphasis on, or they don't put enough weight on in Canada? What are you referring to?
Well, the other illness that I developed is called myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, and it is a multi-system complex illness, and I wish I could tell you what caused it and what sustains it, but there hasn't been enough research into it or research funding, like near zero research funding.
Okay.
But how it relates to today is that the vast majority of people with ME, they got the flu, just the typical flu, and they never recovered. So we see that today with the long COVID patients. They've got COVID, and some of them are just not recovering. Right. So technically, if they haven't recovered in 6 months, they would be given a diagnosis of ME. So we're going to see a huge flood of more patients with ME, all these long COVID patients.
Yeah, and, that's one thing that a lot of people, even though it's been publicized enough, it's not just that 1% die, it's all the people that have the blood clots or lung damage and other symptoms or effects from the COVID virus. How is Canada dealing with COVID? What are your numbers like compared to the U.S.? I know that we're kind of abnormal in that area. We're one of the leaders in numbers. Do you think that's from testing, or is that due to other factors?
I guess Canada's done a pretty good job. Quebec, the province of Quebec, has done the least best job. They have the highest rates of COVID, and mostly in their long-term care facilities, as it is in much of Canada. But we had the big shutdown. We were shut down longer than you folks, and I think that's what helped us get our numbers down and is helping us keep our numbers down.
Are people working with the state, or with the leaders of your country? In terms of that, I think a lot of people in America have obviously been bucking, and there's a certain segment that just refuses to be compliant.
Yeah, there's some folks in Canada who are pushing back against wearing masks. I don't see it as prevalent as I see it in the U.S., so I think it's a smaller number percentage-wise as well.
Sure. I always thought that I've been to a number of different countries. I love to travel, and one of the things that brought to me was the eye-opening realization that Americans are a little pompous, and we think we're a little better than everybody else. You guys are next door, and I live in Wisconsin, which, in all honesty, it's about a footstep away from where you are. How does Canada look at us as, especially the last 4 years? I don't want you to go anywhere dangerous, but, I always wanted to see that outside looking in perspective, and I think you're great at giving that to us.
Yeah, well, I would say that we're not a monolith, so there'll be some folks in Canada who would be, say, Trump supporters,
sure,
but not 40%, maybe, and I'm just taking a stab in the dark here, maybe 10%, were not Canada's naturally left of the U.S. by and large.
Sure.
So we have a tendency towards more of the Democrats.
Okay. I find that, change comes through if you look at it in a socialization aspect, if you're acting inappropriate, your friends are the first one to clue you in, and I would like to think that, these countries now are the same way. We have friendships and allies globally, and if we step out of line and they start looking at us a certain way, I would like to think that we can take a cue and realize, hey, we need to be more global minded. I don't see that happening as much as I'd like, though. This globalization movement, the borders that still exist seem to be getting stronger rather than a cooperational. Do you see that too, or do you find that we're starting to cooperate more, at least in certain industries like healthcare and in certain research, to make things available to everyone so that we can make leaps and bounds?
I'm not sure, but I'm anticipating that there'll be an increase in domestic manufacturing. I know a lot of Canadians are shocked to learn that something like 98% of our medications are produced in China.
Absolutely.
And so when they learn that, all of our medications could just be cut off, they want to move some of that manufacturing to Canada. So I see, because of the pandemic, that there will be sort of a pullback on globalization and a need to increase some industries within the country. Now, whether that'll bleed over into different aspects of healthcare and research, I'm not sure.
I think one of the
it might just be limited to manufacturing. It might be that healthcare continues to be more of a collaborative global effort, which I think is good for all of us.
I do too. I think one thing that would help with medical errors, at least here in the U.S., is standardizing the electronic healthcare record systems. There's currently in the U.S. about 7,000 different types of EHRs, and they're not all efficient at sharing information with one another. One of the issues that I had, which caused a big domino effect, was one hospital system transferred to another hospital system, but in the process of that corrupted, so that the problem list and overview didn't actually match the body of the medical record. There's also in America what we have, what's called HIPAA, which is our Health Information Privacy Act. It doesn't allow victims of violations to seek private recourse. So in my particular situation, I had like 303 pages and 303 that were edited because there was an edit header on it. And then we also were able to find 101 files that were deleted. So that's like encounters, office visits, things like that. And while we can definitively say, look, this happened, in America there's not a recourse. How do those things that I just described, how would that happen, or how would someone in Canada experience that? Would they have recourse, or would they also be stymied?
Yes, when you say that there's different systems in the U.S., it's the same thing here. I know in Toronto there seems to be at least two different hospital systems. So, and they don't speak to each other either. So I've got some of my electronic records with one hospital, some of them were with another hospital, but they're not communicating, and there's no interoperability between them. And I think that is emblematic of the problems with hospitals themselves. They don't share what they learn from medical errors. So you go to hospital A and they chop off the wrong arm, and they learn from that. None of the other hospitals learn what they learned.
Right.
So other hospitals can be repeating the same medical errors.
I had noted when we had talked a little bit earlier in our conversation that you had talked about citizens in Canada having to pay for their own legal counsel, to combat a medical error. In the United States, that's the same way. However, we have funds typically available, at least in Wisconsin for sure. We have what's called a Injured Patients Compensation Fund, which is kind of a horrible irony because that fund doesn't really pay out to injured patients. It is really a pool of money that funds the hospital's legal teams unlimited amounts. So while the victim has to come up with their own counsel, the hospital has these funds that they then don't have to pay back that supplies them with an unlimited legal defense along with their ability to pull in however many medical experts is needed. How does that work in Canada?
Yeah, it's pretty much set up the same way. There's, if I can be blunt, there's collusion between the political/legal system and the medical system. We have different provinces have different laws, but I think all of the provinces have laws that restrict the sharing of medical error information. So that makes it really hard for a patient's lawyer to prepare properly when they can't get access to that information. Our taxpayers' dollars pay for the physician's insurance coverage. So that's CMPA, Canadian Medical Protective Association. Our tax dollars pay those lawyers. And when they harm us, we then have to hire our own lawyers. Now, they've got basically unlimited funding and can hire all the best lawyers and as many of them as they want and all of the expert testimonies they want. So it really is a system set up to favor and protect the hospitals and physicians at the expense of patients.
Yeah. Frustrating. One of the guests that I've had on my podcast was Steve Burrows. Are you familiar with him?
No, I Googled his name. Remind me.
So Steve is a Hollywood director that had a documentary movie come out on HBO that was called Bleed Out. And that centered around his mother, Judy Burrows. And she had actually ended up dying from a medical error as a result of the local hospital. She went in for a routine hip replacement, and they had what's called an EICU. So it was a camera that monitored her, but without an actual physical nurse to be in there with her. And she was bleeding internally, which then ended up giving her brain damage and a whole host of things that she ended up dying from. But Steve then tried to, fight for his mom. And it was a journey. It wasn't something that he started out trying to make this documentary. It was, he experienced so much crap as a result of our current system that he created the documentary to create awareness. He had ended up bringing this into the courts, had money to pay an attorney for a good attorney, and they still ended up losing the case. And it was as a result of 3 different pieces of legislation. One is the single person's law. So if you die and you're over 18, and let's say you have kids, but they're over 18, and you're not married, no one in your family can sue for a medical error if it killed you. Only if you have children that are a minor, or if you have a spouse. So that's called the single person's law. Another one is doctors don't have to testify against other doctors. And so if you're harmed as a result of someone's negligence, doctors, at least here in Wisconsin and in the States, don't want to get involved. That would require a medical expert, and those cost money, and a lot of money at that. So even just to get your situation validated, it costs a ton of money, typically. And so the third law, too, So there's the single persons law. I always get these mixed up. Single persons. The third one, I'm totally mind blanking at the moment. For the sake of the podcast, I'll put a link to that. I'm mind blanking the third one, but point being is that there's sets of laws in legislature that have been snuck in, typically with other bills, that people don't realize that then prohibit certain things, and that's what's happened a lot with those laws that I gave you. They were snuck in with other bills, hidden, not a lot of attention. When they get passed, all of a sudden it makes a huge difference. In Wisconsin, I've heard figures from 87 to 93% of cases that go to trial are lost, and that's as a result of that unlimited pool for the hospitals, and then that legislature that's involved. So for us here in the States, this has been something that people have been working on for 20 plus years. Steve Burrows, Wade Ayers, his sister was another victim. These are two gentlemen that ended up being champions for loved ones because they had no other choice and no one else is there to do that, for their families. And so they stepped into that role. Not everybody has that. So, it's fortunate that, these people were able to make a difference in the awareness that they have, but the change is not very forthcoming, which frustrates me. What have you learned in that aspect? I know we have BLM, All Lives Matter, all of the stuff that's coming in to play for the U.S., which I hope starts to make a difference overall. Is this something that you see Canada fighting for a long time, or is there really a move for transparency, accountability, and limiting liability, so they don't get away with this impetually?
Yeah, I think it's the same situation in Canada. There have been long-time advocates for patient safety, and not much progress has been made. So I think that's indicative of the system. When we have these medical error lawsuits, it's often about one doctor making a mistake or a series of mistakes. And the system, as we've just discussed, the system is set up to ensure that the patients have very minimal chance of success, of getting justice. So I think that really speaks to the problems with the system. So with the medical system, it seems to be a top-down structure, and at the very bottom are the patients. So to my mind, we can struggle and try and change that system over many decades, or we can blow that system up, make it flatter, make it more equitable, and make it so that it's serving patients and not corporate interests. Now, how we actually blow that up and redo it, I'm not sure. But I liken it to in counseling. If I have a sort of a confrontation or a disagreement or a rupture of the relationship with the client, often in repairing that relationship with the client, we can build a stronger therapeutic relationship. So I sort of hold that out as hope in changing the medical system.
Yeah, it's promising to hear it put like that. The how is the big question, but it does need to be flattened. I agree with that. It's that's the $1 trillion question is how to do that. I think that if it doesn't seem to make a difference if you publicize it or if you keep it in the private industry. Does that make a difference to you?
How do you mean?
So, healthcare in the U.S. is private. Healthcare in Canada is federally funded. It doesn't seem to make a difference, though, in terms of at the end of the day, the things that are happening to the patients, those seem to be similar. And so it doesn't seem to be necessarily, privatization that is an issue, just like it wouldn't be an issue if it was federally funded. That doesn't seem to be the issue. It seems to be something else.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I would say that the issue is the medical culture, the God complex, the arrogance, all of those negative aspects that you experience if you have a complex illness or if you have experienced medical error. So to me, it's changing the medical culture and that medical system.
Do you think we could, obviously sharing the information too, so that everyone can learn from the mistakes being made is important. How do we get them on board to do that?
I don't know. Whenever I take a look at the airline industry and how transparent they are with their errors and how low a rate of injury and death airlines have, I ask myself and anybody who will listen to me, how come the medical system isn't taking the same approach?
That's a great question. You're very intuitive, especially with your background. So as a counselor, I would ask, what is your view of that?
Of why we're not having a transparent medical system?
Why do you think that change hasn't happened in healthcare as it has in the airlines?
It's got to be the culture and the status quo. It's hard to change the status quo. Like, I imagine a lot of doctors go into the healthcare and into training to be a physician with these idealistic attitudes of wanting to help people, and they're going to make a change in the world. And they come with very strong values that drive their career path. And then they get immersed in this system that comes up against a lot of those values. And they either have to give in and become part of the system, or leave the system and take a career path otherwise. Or if they try to work within the system, but without towing the line, then the physicians in Ontario, it's called the Physicians of Ontario, and they're the ones who discipline doctors. So if you're not towing the line, they will take away your license. So doctors are not incentivized to think outside of the box that they're in or outside of the culture that they're in. And I think that contributes to why physicians have such a high suicide rate. Their values are coming up against the values of the system they're working in.
Which creates a cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah.
Becomes hard to live with, I think, after a while.
I think if we just take a look at the hours, so doctors and nurses often work long shifts, 10-hour, 12-hour, 24-hour shifts, which are ridiculous.
Right.
We wouldn't let people who work in a factory making widgets work long hours like that. Right. Why would we have people who are dealing with people's lives work long hours like that?
Right.
Well, it's because of the culture. It's because that's the status quo. That's the way they want to do it, and they're not going to change no matter how many people they kill and injure.
Gets frustrating. And the best that I can do, because I had to be a victim, and my body's broken, but my voice isn't, and I'm really tenacious. I hate having to accept things that are wrong. And my own therapist might say, it's probably not a good thing. But for me, when you see the harm that it's caused in your own life, and then you realize there's nothing that you can do about it, it creates a great deal of despair. And the things that you have to deal with as a result of the medical error, whether you've lost the wrong arm or had surgeries you didn't need, or were misdiagnosed, those create this domino effect that is really even hard to calculate in any way. I know that you deal with a lot of victims, and you're in counseling. What would be the first thing that you would say to a victim in terms of how to accept this and move forward? Is there a path that people need to start with to start mending things in their lives as a result of this? Because for a lot of us, we get stuck there because it's such a travesty in our lives that it's like, goodness, what do I do now?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a concept called post-traumatic growth. Have you heard of that, Bo?
I have a little bit, but I'm not very familiar.
Yeah, and it can result. It's not an experience everyone who's experienced trauma has, but the majority of people can experience growth from trauma. And it can take basically three forms. It can be sort of an internal realization of a strength that you didn't know you had before, or a strength that you built up because of the experience. It can take the form of stronger relationships with people that are important in your family, so building up those relationships, and that can have a lot of meaning. And it can also take place on more of a societal or social or institutional level, where you're making change on that level, and all of those things can have meaning, and that is what would be called post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
So that's the sort of overarching goal that I enter a therapeutic relationship with somebody who's experienced especially medical era trauma. And with that goal in mind, how we define success and how we define the meaning or what is that growth is individual. So that's the process that I engage the clients with, is how to figure out how to make meaning out of your experience.
I think finding purpose is, for me, was a turning point. Finding something that I can proactively put myself into and try to help. I'm intelligent, but by no means am I Mensa. I'm just an ordinary guy. And then also my accident caused me a brain injury, which makes things difficult every once in a while, especially with some of these. But the overall part is, no matter what position that you might be in, and I'm talking more to our listeners at this point, finding a purpose within your life and something that you can proactively put your time and attention to, even if it's just a little bit every day or once a week or whatever it is, can make a profound difference in how you're feeling and how you're dealing with some of these medical errors and the situations that come along with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very important. I often consider humanity and humans to be meaning-making machines.
Yeah.
No matter what sort of information or things that we observe, we automatically try to attach meaning to it. Like in our discussion of trying to figure out how come the medical system is the way it is, we're trying to put meaning to that. So it's a natural process to try to attempt to put meaning to all of our experiences. Why did the doctor do that? Why is the system this way? And then there can also be the more proactive type of meaning. How can I make meaning out of this experience? How can I make meaning that has purpose,
Sure.
you say?
As fulfilling as this kind of work is, it has a deepness that comes with it. I've had to take a little time off here and there just when things got, it's a topic that's depressing. It's a little overwhelming. How do you deal with the deepness of it? Do you have an outlet that gets you your happy back, or what's your tool?
I think the most important thing for me as a counselor is to realize that I'm not responsible for a client's change. I am responsible for creating a space and a process that they can make the change they want, but I'm not responsible for that change. And so by not being responsible for their change, that's a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. Yeah. So I'm not preoccupied with, are they succeeding in their change? I'm preoccupied with creating a space and a process that allows them to make the change they want.
That's great. I want to we're getting on to the 40-minute. I like to try to keep these to around an hour. I'd like to kind of dive in a little bit about you. You strike me as very intelligent, very empathetic. Where did you get some of those qualities from? Do you have a very close-knit family? Was it the way you were raised? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I guess so. I grew up on a farm, like I said. I probably the empathy is partially genetic, partially the home environment. Both my parents are very grounded, stable people, thoughtful, not reactionary. So I had that sort of model moving forward. Same thing. I don't consider myself that intelligent. I speak to so many people that are so intelligent that, right. It makes me feel humble. So I can't really speak to that too much.
That's funny. That's the same word that popped into my head. I just feel humble. It's great when I can talk to people. I always think of it like the ancient Greeks, Socrates and Plato and all those people sitting around and just talking about the topics of the day. But it's more than just talking about the topics. It's instituting the change that comes along with the ideas and the foundation of morals that you base off of the conversations that you're having. And one of the nice things that I'm seeing with I was born in 74, so I saw pre-internet and post-internet, and we definitely have a ability now that we've never had before to talk to anyone pretty much anywhere in the world from your computer at home. As a result, whether that's, some of these kids that are gaming on their PlayStations and Xboxes, we're developing friendships that we've never had that are crossing borders that we were never able to get to. And my hope is that one of the evolving things that will come with that is more of a sense of communion globally than we do as separatists, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's really great to be able to talk to someone that's in Canada. You're literally maybe a state away from me in terms of distance, but you have your own culture, your own political system. And I wasn't sure, talking with you, if you would even have the same experiences that I've had here, or that the victims that I've talked to so far have had here. But the reality is that these issues don't really know a border. They're really not tied into a political system. They're more, like you said, a cultural thing within the healthcare community. And those are things that we can change. I think that people like Steve Burrows, people like yourself, I'm hoping to try to do what I can to give a platform for voice. But as more people get tied into this, my hope is that, this is something that we can change. 20 years ago, people that were working on this movement didn't have the same tools and abilities that we have now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I concur. I think technology is a beautiful thing for us, especially in wanting to connect with other people that have had the same experiences, and then also to work together to create change. And I wonder if COVID isn't an opportunity. We're seeing the long COVID patients being gaslighted. And gaslighted is by no means a long COVID-only experience.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's an opportunity to leverage the COVID pandemic towards greater patient safety, even if it's only addressing gaslighting. That would be a huge thing.
Yeah. One of the things, especially with medical errors, with the surge of COVID patients, obviously places like New York were saturated where they were overflowing into the parking lots and things like that. Any epicenters in Canada? Any big ones? Have you had huge spikes? I guess, what are your numbers compared to ours?
I don't know the numbers offhand, but I do know that our long-term care facilities is where the majority of the deaths took place, and there's been a lot of political and public discourse and anger around the fact that the folks in the long-term care facilities were not allowed to be visited by any of their family members. So their isolation became extreme. And a lot of those family members were going and acting as support workers, doing some of the care needs. So some of the care was then decreased the quality of care in the long-term care home. So there's that whole sort of discussion around that. And now that kids are going back to school in September, there's a lot of concern around that. I know my sister is deciding to do homeschooling.
With COVID and being HIV positive, how have you had to alter your life? Are you more susceptible to COVID's infection than another person would be? I don't know. I'm of two minds of that. Yes, my immune system is compromised because I have HIV. On the other hand, I'm taking 3 different HIV meds, and they often have cross antiviral properties. So I remember reading one article way back in April that the researcher was saying on a small sample that they found that the HIV positive patients who got COVID did not get as sick or as long as the general population. So maybe my HIV meds are kind of protective. But truthfully, I'm far more concerned about my ME because it is also an immune compromised illness. And so I think that the ME makes me much more susceptible to COVID, getting COVID, and negative, even fatal outcomes of it. So have you restructured your life? Do you not go out as much? Do you stay away from social places? What kind of changes have you made?
Well, I work from home, and so I do all my counseling via video counseling. So the biggest change that happened was they closed down the dog park. So my dog couldn't go to the dog park. So it really did not have a big impact on my life. And because I have complex chronic illnesses that limit my energy, I wasn't going out very much anyway. I would do a lot of my socializing, either video chats or on the phone. So it hasn't impacted my life too much in that way.
Well, that's great. I think that it's interesting to me. In the States, we had kind of a social panic. People were buying up toilet paper, just the weirdest things. Did you have anything like that happen in Canada?
Yeah, we had the same run on toilet paper that I think the whole world did, which is sort of a strange
How did you
thing.
view that through your background and your experiences? How did you look at that?
I concur. It's a panic behavior, but it's also a time. Panic may be too strong of a word, but it's also a time to know that our world is undergoing a great change, and it is never going to be the same again. Although the world's always changing, we're just going through a huge change right now. And so I see some people in total denial that the world has changed and that it's not going to go back to the way it was before. And they struggle more with how to move forward. They experience a lot more anxiety. And then I also see another group of folks who acknowledge the changes going on, and they are adjusting to it and preparing for the next stages of change. So back in March, I started to take a deep dive into understanding how the monetary and banking systems work. And so that has been quite edifying and has really sort of changed the way I view the banking system and the monetary system, to be honest. And I think if most people understood how the monetary system worked, and if they hadn't been teaching this to us in school like they should have been, if people understood how the monetary system worked, they'd be out in the streets with pitchforks the next day, because it's basically just a big Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. This is a
so
good
that's
time.
That's the next big thing that's going to affect us globally. Is there's going to be economic chaos. In some parts of the world, it's going to be very ugly, and in other parts of the world, it'll just be kind of ugly.
This might be a good time to plug your Millions Are Missing Canada Facebook page, because that's what you're talking about, correct? With the money and such?
Well, Millions Missing Canada is a patient advocacy group. So it's around advocating for greater research funding for ME, greater patient care for ME. So it's focused on ME. Yeah.
I got that confused by the name. I apologize. Anything that we can plug for you regarding what you're working on currently?
Well, I'm going to be interviewing you for my podcast, which is called Medical Error Interviews. And I'm going to hear about your story. I had to hold myself back from asking you to unpack your medical error experience. So I look forward to interviewing you about that. And I guess the other things that are going on in my life, I'm immersed in the patient safety. So I'm involved in a couple of groups in Canada around patient safety.
How can they find you to help support you for our listeners?
Around the patient safety stuff?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I guess just following me on my Facebook. So I'm Scott Simpson, and you can follow me on Facebook because I post my medical error interviews on there.
Okay.
And that's the easiest way to get in contact with me.
All right, perfect. So Scott Simpson on Facebook, and he's located in Canada, just in case there's multiples. He's the good-looking guy with the bald head.
Yeah, that's right. I'm the one in Toronto.
Yeah. Last question for you. So you've been working on this for a while. How has this changed you in your life, and what's the greatest reward that you've taken away from this?
Well, the podcast, I think the biggest impact it's had on me is that each time I hear these stories of medical error, I'm shocked all over again. And so I'm shocked that I'm still shocked by how horrible the medical system is to people. So that's an ongoing experience that I have by doing the interviews. But I think the meaning that comes out of it is that, well, it takes place on a couple of levels. A lot of the guests find it therapeutic to be able to share their story. Often they've not had that experience of being validated in their story.
Absolutely.
And then when the stories get out there, other people identify with them, know that they're not alone, that they share that experience. And I think most importantly, people may learn to educate themselves more about whatever particular procedure or illness they may be having. Like, for instance, I'll think twice before I go for another MRI with contrast. I think twice before I'll just go to any old dentist. It's made me more aware of certain illnesses and things that I need to do should that illness come up in my life or somebody that I love in their life.
Well said. That's exactly the same reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing here. I was really excited to interview you. I saw your work, and before we started the podcast, I thanked you. It is nice to see someone else trying to do a lot of the same things that I'm doing here, but is located right next door in Canada. It opened my eyes to realize that this issue is not just a states-bound issue. This is healthcare doesn't have borders. It's a global industry. And this is a culture within that industry that needs to change. Steve, I think, really nailed it best, Steve Burrows, and highly recommend that interview if you ever like to listen to that stuff. It was just so good. But Steve said that transparency, accountability, and a true apology go a long way for these victims. But covering up and dismissive and not validating what they went through then creates this cognitive dissonance where you think, oh, am I crazy? You need validation. And then when you realize that these things have happened, then you realize, well, am I alone? No. There's a lot of other people that this has happened to. And it reframes how you feel. You don't feel nuts anymore. You feel validated. You realize that it's a systemic issue, and all we can do is share and hope that the many voices put together become a shout or a scream where people then pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put, though. The only thing I could think to add to that is that what would speed up the process is if more politicians, physicians, and celebrities experienced medical error and spoke out about it. That would facilitate a faster change. Right.
I think part of that reason that I don't think they do is just because they are that special VIP. No one wants to kill Johnny Depp, or no one, you know what I mean? There's just a higher level of care I think they receive than what the ordinary person does, because they realize, well, geez, if we screw up, then this is a national news thing rather than, something that's limited to our community.
Yeah, that's right. And their lawyers probably realize, too, that if they're a high-profile person, it's easier and better to settle out of court with a non-disclosure agreement than to fight them.
Well, I want to thank you again for coming on my podcast. I absolutely look forward to your podcast. The biggest reason is that in doing my podcast, I've shared bits and pieces, but I've wanted to find someone perfect to interview me because my story is so huge, for lack of better words. And that's not to minimize anybody else's experiences, but in my own head, I continually have to take a deep breath and just realize, you know what? Cup half full, one foot in front of the other. It gets frustrating,
that's good self-talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's part of the process.
Yeah. So again, Scott Simpson is my guest today. Scott lives in Canada. He's a counselor. He works on medical error interviews along with some other things that we've already discussed in the podcast. Please support Scott. You can look him up on his Facebook page at Scott Simpson. He's located in Toronto, Canada. His interviews of medical error victims are truly well done. They are really easy to listen to. I like your style. And the stories that you've been able to bring out of the victims has been really, really good. And I'm hoping that it helps them heal along with helps this movement to create the change. So thank you very much. And I'm going to end this now.